This module is on the role of social movements, special interest groups on US foreign policy making. Now, overall, they're providing this external influence on the policy process. We have different types of people, interest groups, organizations, businesses have different resources, different information, access, interests. Most of them are transnational in nature. So again, if you're looking at most of foreign policy issues are transnational in nature, a lot of these groups are too. Some of them are ad hoc, focusing on one particular issue, refugee crisis, public health crisis, certain conflict. They are constantly changing size, mission, and tactics. So overall, we see this power shift that really in the last since the end of the since the end of the Cold War, we have a lot more private groups shaping public agendas as well as, and that includes foreign policy. Now, what are the origins of social movements on the policy-making process? Really, the last 2 decades, end of the Cold War, we've seen a lot, enormous growth of movement activity. One we have a myriad form of protest, normative promotion, looking at norms, laws, attitudes, ethnic representation. Now, these two social movements, why is that? One is that participation kind of opens a whole new world, which is almost like a religious experience. This revelation that, it empowers yourself, you achieve social change, you impact public discourse, you scrutinize politicians. So entering this world, it's a very powerful experience. And has a profound impact as a social movement on the policy making progress. Now, one is that policy decisions are really isolated movements, and it is continuous policy making process. And now we have persons, private persons, groups, organizations have an impact on it. One is civil society, looking at gay rights, looking at environmental protection. Any other forms of human rights, and then epistemic communities. Epistemic communities are, scientific communities. There have an impact on the policy-making process. So again, looking at environmental policy ought to be the impact of a scientific consensus of what is at stake. That have different forms that, of course, can also, looking at the growth and proliferation of WMDs was a scientific product. Looking at, physicists and other scientists in the life sciences. So this is important, and of course, sometimes science is under attack. The scientific consensus is being questioned, outsourced by ideologies or non-scientific input. Changes in foreign policy decision may happen immediately. It might have a long-term impact. This is, the entire process of social movements is that it's an ongoing enterprise. We have non-governmental organizations, we're looking at corporations, we're looking at interest groups, think tanks. They are either domestic or transnational, pursue policy goals, so want to change policy according to what they think is best for them and for the country. Evaluate, ongoing and past policy, demand, put pressure on government actors, and of course we have different forms of relationships. So again, DoD and RAND, the think tank, has always been very good. We had not a very good relationship between the NAACP and the Bush administration, for example. So again, that depends, that relationship. Dynamics of group action. We're looking at large groups of citizens determined to change government policies, groups of coalitions, create good policies that didn't exist before, change or reform bad policies, based on political opportunities, based on political structures, formal and informal conditions that channel activity. So again, looking at the two-party system in the United States, the winner takes it all, that they really quite often act as a third, fourth, fifth party. That is particularly the case in the United States system. And then norms that represent values and visions how society interacts with the state. And again, fighting the system. So again, looking at social movements and their impact on policymaking. Of course, they are most successful if they can grab legislators' attention. Again, if there are concerns over re-election, this is usually when social movements and any other interest group are most likely to influence policy. Now, how do we define success in social movements? We have three factors here. Policy change. So again, you cause the government to change policy on a certain issue. Acceptance of the protesting groups, valid representative for social change. So again, you accept the legitimacy of that particular group. That itself is a success. And then changing norms and values. Societies rather than the government is the target here. Redefine political arena by changing perception and social values. Looking at the Human Rights Campaign, for example, you could really look at all three elements. The Human Rights Campaign wanted, rights for members of the LGBT community. Human Rights Campaign several years ago, not necessarily a group which many in the public realm as well as in government had accepted as a legitimate group. So again, once the Human Rights Campaign actually became accepted by the vast majority in society and government, that itself was a success for that particular social movement group. And then thirdly, changing norms and values of how Americans ought to view members of the LGBT community, the norms about same-sex marriage. So we're looking at the government changing legislation, but also that particular group is interested in changing, how society interacts with different minorities, different groups, protects their civil rights, and accepts them as equal members of society. So here, this is a quite a formidable challenge. Sorry. These three elements, just an example of the Human Rights Campaign. Of course, not a foreign policy social movement group, and more domestic policy. Changes in policy process involves expansion of the scope of political conflict. So common reform for government is, it requires consultation with groups to finalize foreign policy decisions. And also the government may actually set up mechanisms to review grievances, appeal decisions that have already been made. So looking at Equal Employment Commission, Environmental Protection Agency. So again, these were agencies that are created because of pressure groups, because of groups putting that pressure on the government. Now, looking at ethnic interest groups and foreign policy, we really see that they have gained a lot more impact on the foreign policy making process, in particular after the end of the Cold War, where we said before it's unclear where the United States was heading. Distinction between foreign and domestic became less clear, and Congress became a lot more engaged in foreign policy making, and there's a lot of more bipartisan battles. Now, formation of ethnic interest groups, of course, US politics has facilitated growth because of multicultural fabric of society, and the government itself is becoming more porous and more accepting of the impact of diversity, of what a positive force for change it can be. And the claim, of course, ethnicity itself is a natural base for group formation and organized political action. So again, you can see the success story of this is one is the organizational strength of ethnic lobbying group. You have a large unified space, salience and resonance of the message with broader US public, the tacting of casting positions in terms of oppositionalist issues. Now again, what is an oppositionalist issue is we can all agree that Israel is an ally. We can all agree that Northern Ireland ought to be part of the UK. We can all agree that this is the most important. We can all agree that the US ought to support country X, Y, and Z. So this is that particular tactic. Again, they are more influential when congressional involvement is necessary and presidential popularity is low. And of course, we have this mutually supportive relationship, provision of information, votes, campaign contributions. So, politicians certainly are courting ethnic interest groups. We have three stages of ethnic group influence. First stage, German, Scandinavian, Irish, later Italian acted as drag of US involvement in world affairs. During the Cold War, all American ethnic groups were really internationalist, backed a very assertive US foreign policy against the Soviet Union, promoting national self-government abroad, and ethnic and national identities tended to coincide. Now, this changed with the end of the Cold War. The third stage, whether we have a reassertion of the power of society relative to the state, that facilitated more access of American ethnic lobbies. We had lack of a bipartisan consensus. So again, you could see how different ethnic groups were accessing and influencing. Looking at the Balkan conflict, one of the first civil wars after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, that is a prime example of Bosnian Muslims, Serbs in the United States trying to push their respective agendas to the Clinton administration. Now, moving on to business interest groups, we have different business interest groups: National Association of Manufacturers, Consumer Federation of America. We have several multinational corporations which have their own lobbying apparatus. Really looking at structural theories of international relations, neo-Marxist neo-Marxist interpretation of international relations, how one particular class is the dominant factor in policy making. Marx said, "The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry under the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." So again, Marx is only thinking in terms of class, of course, working class, and the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie, those who have the capital and the mode of production, that everything is being dictated by the bourgeoisie. Again, example, structural theorists, neo-Marxists would look at to George W. Bush's invasion to invade Iraq. They would only see it from a structuralist lens. That if you look at a lot of the contracts awarded to Halliburton subsidiaries, Cheney was the CEO previously of Halliburton, and different subsidiaries of Halliburton were getting lucrative contracts in non-bidding environment. So again, we had the Congressional Committee on Government Reform said the secret award of a contract without competition is highly unusual. So again, this will be one theory looking at the power of business interest groups. So again, a lot of structural theory in international relations would look at the power of business interest groups and how they sway foreign policy. Now again, what are the techniques for any of interest groups? Foreign policy legislation has 5 stages: writing a bill, hearings, mark up the relevant committees, votes on the floor in the House and the Senate, reconciliation of any differences, the appropriation process, actual amounts of money set for defense, spending, foreign aid, etc. Lobbyists will influence all of these stages. Looking at campaign contributions, 1982 study, half of the contributions by the defense industry PAC went to members of Congress Armed Service Committee and Defense and Military Construction Subcommittee. So you can see that comes back to the Iron Triangle, to those 3 poles: military defense contractors, the DoD, and Congress Defense Appropriations Committee. They also influence the executive branch, working closely with mid-level officials, departments, and agencies when they formulate policy, trade policy, a whole system of advisory committees that's effectively used by lobbyists to influence official trade negotiations, that they can actually sit in the room, and also, of course, influence appointments, and of course, are actually members of the federal government, high-ranking either secretaries in agencies or mid-level officials. And then lastly, influencing public opinion. The media here is used as a magnifying glass and as a megaphone. Now, to conclude, let me look at reference here, James Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, in which he says, "The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to the violence of faction." Now again, here faction, Madison talks about faction as a group whose interest or common impulse of passion were adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So again, James Madison here is very careful in looking at if we cater too much to the influence of one particular faction, it would be actually had an adverse effect on the national interest. So again, if a nation asked to make the ultimate sacrifice, like going to war for interest, but the more group-specific, the consequences for the morale of society and, in fact, for the democratic fabric can be devastating. History has shown that empires and great powers had been brought down by catering to vested interests of certain entities, groups, and individuals. So again, if you look at a lot of literature on empires, European empires expanded, conquered, acquired new markets, colonized, not because of that these were wise decisions in foreign policy terms, but you had the elite, economic elite in particular, political elite in those countries pushing for the expansion and colonization. And then lastly, foreign policy issues are highly emotionally charged. So again, Madison warns us about the impulse of passion. So again, you could say that maybe Madison was a bit of a realist, that we ought to be pragmatic and scientific in our approach to foreign policy, and we should not cater to the impulse of passion, to the interest of one particular special interest group. Please do the reading on the textbook on special interest groups.